The president wants to spy on 200 million Americans without a warrant. Has he read this document, which he was sworn to uphold?
Now, I will not have you libel Abraham Lincoln.
I don't understand the problem with registering guns. We register cars.
Mark Levine brings you the news the government doesn't want you to know.
Today, an explosive story about connections between white supremacists and Islamic terrorists.
When there's a conflict between Scalia's conservative values and the Constitution of the United States, he throws away the Constitution.
When we do have secret prisons, that is not what America's all about.
Let's go to Mark in 5, 4, 3, 2.
Good evening, America. Welcome to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Mark Levine. We bring you the news from Washington here and around the world, and there was a lot of news in Washington this week from all three branches of government. In the executive branch, President Obama is trying to decide how to deal with the sequester, the $85 billion cut in spending that apparently no one wanted, but that Congress and the president passed into law back in 2011 as an event so horrible they'd have to do something to avert it. Well, they didn't avert it, and the sequester is here. And now everything from national parks to airports are feeling the pinch of it. President Obama is on a goodwill tour, inviting Republicans to talk with him in hopes of a grand bargain. The real question is, will that grand bargain be achieved, or will it damage economic growth? Speaking of Congress, Rand Paul, Libertarian senator from Kentucky, staged his own filibuster, which is something we haven't seen, a talking filibuster. Really, I can't think of one that's occurred in at least 10 years. And it was about United States drone policy. Senator Paul wanted to know if the United States could use unmanned aircraft to drop a bomb or otherwise harm an American on American soil. The government said no, except in extraordinary circumstances, such as an imminent threat when an American citizen is in combat against the United States. Is that sufficient? We'll discuss that as well. In the third branch, the United States Supreme Court is dealing with two very important questions of civil rights. One has to do with the Voting Rights Act, that act in 1965 that penalized states that tried to penalize African Americans from voting. Is there still a need for that? And another case before the United States Supreme Court, going to oral argument probably next week or the week thereafter, has to do with marriage equality. Is the Defense of Marriage Act constitutional? Can the federal government tell states, sorry, you can't marry people even if you want to? And also California's Proposition 8. Is that constitutional? And finally, we look abroad. We go to Rome, where the conclave is starting. We have 115 cardinals voting on the next pope. Where should that pope be from? Is it the case that 65% European conclave could consider maybe a pope from outside of Europe? To help me answer all of these questions, I've invited my guest, Mark Royce. He is a PhD candidate at George Mason University. He is a former chapter president and founder of the Alexander Hamilton Society, which specializes in conservative thought. Mark Royce, welcome to the Inside
Thank
Scoop.
you. It's good to be back.
All right, so let's start with the sequester. A number of economists are saying that this $85 billion in cuts, we can argue about how big or small it is. You could say it's some 2.5% of the federal budget, but because it's being crammed in a few months period, in some budgets, like the military budget, it's actually as high as 9%. But whatever the range of the cuts, most economists seem to believe it's going to hurt our growth, our GDP growth, by at least 0.5%, and it's going to harm the nation's economy. President Obama is on a goodwill tour. He's invited Republicans over for dinner for the first time in a long time, trying to get to a grand bargain. So let me ask you a number of questions. First of all, how bad is the sequester? And secondly, do you think there'll be a way to get around it?
Well, I think that the sequester, as it's called, which is kind of a bad name for it,
True.
I think indiscriminate slice or hack would be probably better description.
Absolutely. I was going to say New Year's Day we had the fiscal cliff, which has that drama associated with it.
Drama.
Sequester doesn't have the same dramatic
There
force.
always has to be drama in Washington,
Yes.
rule number one.
True.
So sequester or whatever you want to call it. Short answer, I think that it will have a marginal deleterious effect on economic growth. It will hurt it a little bit. It's not apocalypse. It's not another Great Depression, nor should it even be equated with the financial catastrophes of 2008.
I agree with you on
It's a minor hit, it's a minor injury. But I do think that it can produce an acute psychological effect. As a number of these most visible services that people rely on get hit. I'll give you a couple that were today in the Washington Post. One of them, lead story in the Washington Post this morning, was the sequestering of Yellowstone National Park.
I read that.
And right now, it's a pleasant day here in Virginia, but out there it's very cold and the snow is melting. But they don't have Yellowstone's losing $1.8 million, and so they can't melt the snow with the machines that they need to do, so they just have to wait for the sun to come out and melt the snow. Okay, maybe that won't hurt them, but another...
Before you get to the next one, let me just
sure.
talk about Wyoming and Yellowstone, because here's what I found interesting.
Okay.
So the Wyoming governor, and who's a staunch conservative Republican, someone who argued very much for the sequester, and in fact the local mayor, I forget of the town that's nearby Yellowstone, they were both complaining vociferously, this is going to hurt business, it's going to hurt tourism, it's going to hurt their jobs. And so the park administrator, Mr. Wendt, I believe was his name, said to the governor of Wyoming, all right, you plow the roads. It's in Wyoming. You want the roads plowed, you plow them. And he said, oh, no, we can't use state monies for that. To me, that sparks a little bit of hypocrisy. If the Wyoming governor thinks that the roads to the national park should be plowed, he has the authority to order it himself. He decided not to, and yet he's blaming the federal government. Do you see some hypocrisy there?
Of course, it's completely hypocritical for the governor of Wyoming to then dictate terms to the national park director and somehow hold him responsible. No, that's absurd.
Okay. I just want to make sure we agree on that. Go on.
Sure.
You're talking about other impacts.
Okay, well, and then to change course to Washington and to discuss our nation's most hallowed ground, and that's Arlington National Cemetery. And so the Department of Defense has stated that even internments and burial service at Arlington National will be affected by the sequestration. A friend of mine from church had her uncle interned just this past week, and so we're going to have many families. We're going to have longer wait times. We're not going to have the same level of access to Arlington National that they would have had prior to this event.
There's also going to be longer lines at airports. The Transportation Security Administration won't have the people to deal with that. I know the White House tours got canceled. President Obama, that we saved a little bit of money there.
Well, I might not have been invited regardless, but...
Well, no. Those are actually allowed to the public by members of Congress who allow them. The point is this. We have a nation's economy that has the lowest unemployment rate, frankly, since President Obama's been president. It just hit 7.7%, the most recent jobs report. And what that jobs report said was private sector growth is doing pretty good. Jobs are growing in the private sector. But because of the public sector cutting jobs due to cutting in spending, we are actually not achieving the growth we could achieve, and unemployment could be much lower. It seems to me that the time for, I'm not saying there's never a time to cut spending. The time to cut spending to me is when you have a time of full employment, when you have, like in the 1990s, I think Bill Clinton was perfect in giving us a surplus. But now we're just coming out of this shaky financial recession. We're just getting our feet back. It seems to me that the time for cutting is not now, but maybe 2 or 3 years from now.
Perhaps. Well, there's the time to cut spending. There's also the way to cut spending.
That's true, too.
That's also important. And Congress could really, Mark, almost solve this issue in a matter of hours if they simply convened the Congress and passed a law granting the president the authority to say, take this lump sum of money, and then you can cut it from where you want to. Down through the agency heads, we say we have to remove $85 billion, but you can do it in the way that you want to, as opposed to having this ridiculous imposition as if our government could not say that we're not going to take money from Yellowstone or from meat inspections or from TSA and then take it from somewhere else. The president should have the authority to do that. He shouldn't be in prison.
I'm perfectly fine with that. I do agree you can cut better with a scalpel than with a sledgehammer. But I also think it's wrong to suggest that even that is easy, that there's so much waste in government that you could, $85 billion is nothing. Someone's going to hurt.
I don't suggest it's easy. I suggest you can run an audit, you can look at it, go line by line and do it.
And I agree that that's the better way to do it, and I support that. But my point is that, we over here in Washington don't think too much that Yellowstone is delayed 2 weeks, but the people in Wyoming truly care. We may not care about a certain subsidy to a certain defense contractor, but they care and their workers care. Whether it's not increasing federal salaries in the D.C. area or whether it's some airport out in rural Oklahoma, where the cuts happen, people feel it. And I think sometimes we wave our hands and say, look at all this waste, but our waste and our pork is another person's bread and butter.
Precisely. It is hypocritical, and we're all to blame. And the Defense Department has business in every congressional district. They know how to play this game. In Washington, everyone, it seems, works for a contractor or public school teachers, whatever. So we're all, to some degree, dependent on the state. I suppose if you want to sort of dig for the philosophical issue, as a fiscal conservative, I do think that we have a political economy that has become far too much dependent upon state support and state intervention. We've
Well,
exchanged.
where would you withdraw? Let me just lay it out there. You've got $85 billion to cut,
Okay.
Mr. President Royce. So where would you take your scalpel out to begin?
I would probably start with some superfluous weapon systems.
We can agree on that.
Yes.
We can agree on that. There's a second engine, I believe, for the F-35 that's made in Speaker Boehner's home district that the military has rejected. The Pentagon said, no, we like this engine design better than the second engine, and yet they're still developing the second engine for reasons that can only be jobs in a certain district in Ohio, which is a very important electoral state, but has nothing to do with the national interest. So I certainly agree with you there. Let me bring you to the Democratic bill to deal with the sequester, because it did two primary things. You may remember more, but I remember two main things. One, it cut out large agricultural subsidies to agribusinesses. Farm prices are actually pretty high right now. Farmers are doing okay, and most of this money doesn't go to your family farmer. And I'm fine with leaving the money to family farmer, but the agribusiness that makes over $250,000 a year doesn't need more subsidies from the United States government. It would cut those. The other things it would cut is what's called the Warren Buffett tax, the specific benefits we give to hedge fund owners. Basically, if you're an ordinary janitor, you pay an ordinary income tax rate, but if you're a hedge fund manager earning $1 billion a year, you pay the capital gains rate, and so you save a huge amount of money in taxes. Just agricultural subsidies, getting rid of the Buffett tax, and getting rid of subsidies to corporate jet owners alone would fix the subsidy. It was passed by the Democrats in the Senate. Should the Republicans pass that in the House?
Yes.
Okay.
They should.
There we go.
But a couple of points on that. On the agriculture issue, there's perhaps no particular sector in which the free trade, the free market ideology that I espouse is more hypocritical than on agriculture. The extent to which we protect our own native farmers, the Europeans do this too big time.
So
it blocks
Japan,
access
China?
to the third world, and Africans can't import their goods and so forth. And then on the issue of essentially progressive taxation, we've discussed this before. I am not representative of most conservatives with regard, most Republicans with regard to progressive taxation. I do support. I do believe that the rich should actually pay more. It's an idea endorsed twice by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations.
Actually, yes, I was just going to say, a lot of people have not read The Wealth of Nations. They talk about the invisible hand and the free market as if Adam Smith believed in no government regulation. When you read The Wealth of Nations, I know you know, Adam Smith believed we had to have government to prevent fraud and monopolies and things like that.
Especially anti-monopolies.
Right.
True.
All right, we're going to get back to the issue of drones, another issue of executive policy. Rand Paul took a stand against it, a very loud stand, and interesting, some Democrats joined in. It's something I think that crosses party and ideological lines. What should the United States policy be? When can the U.S. attack militarily an American citizen on American soil? We'll get that answer when we come back. If you want to call in, it's 888-488-MARK.
This year, 28,000 Americans will be diagnosed with oral cancer. Every year, 7,000 Americans die of oral cancer.
I'm Eva Cohen, and I'm an oral cancer survivor. I didn't fit the profile. I didn't smoke or drink. I had no family history of cancer, no family history of cancer. I was 31 years old. 31 years old. I went to see my dentist about a sore in my mouth that wouldn't heal. It was oral cancer. I had to have a radical neck dissection and a portion of my tongue reconstructed. I didn't know if I was going to live or die.
I'm Surgeon General Richard Carmona. The survival rate for oral cancer is only 50%. Oral cancer can happen to anyone. If you have a sore or lesion in your mouth that doesn't heal within 2 weeks, see your dentist. Early detection is the key.
Early detection saves lives. I know.
1 in 8 Americans goes hungry. One idea helped change that. A community started a garden that blossomed into farmers markets. 1 in 6 children lives in poverty. One group of women found an answer by opening a daycare center that their neighbors could afford. Today, 36 million Americans live in poverty. But one by one, people are helping themselves and each other to change the picture of poverty to one of hope. For easy ways you can help, visit povertyusa.org.
2 words for you. Pop quiz. Ready? Name any funny movie. A drama. Name a mystery. And one more thing. Name the movie your kids saw today in science class.
Know what really matters. Know about your kid's school. And know about your kid. Find out 100 ways to know more, do more.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
This is Mark Levine. If you want to call in and join this discussion, that's something that you can't do on many TV shows these days. We welcome your calls. Just pick up the phone and dial 571-749-1166. Or if you're watching on the internet at marklevinetalk.com, you can dial toll-free at 888-488-MARK. That's 888-488-6275. We welcome your contribution. My guest, as I said, is Mark Royce. He's a PhD candidate at George Mason University. He's also the chapter founder and former president of the Alexander Hamilton Society, which focuses on preserving conservative thought. So, Mark Royce, I want to direct you to Rand Paul's filibuster. It was an interesting thing. You know, I actually like the old filibusters. I have no problem against the old talking filibusters. I'd like to see more of them, in fact. One of the things I want to see is filibuster reform that says, you want to do a filibuster? Do it the old-fashioned way. Get up there and talk for 13 hours. That shows a certain commitment rather than just saying, oh, we don't have 60 votes, let's move on. So I kind of appreciate that. And I appreciate the topic on which Rand Paul was talking. I think we do need to know when the government of any president, Bush, Obama, Republican, Democrat, says it has the authority to strike without trial, without due process, an American citizen on American soil. I want that to be very limited. So I'm glad the issue came. But I would say the Obama administration answered the question. Maybe they took a little pushing to do it, but they answered the question. They delivered a memo that said exactly when they would do it. And they also said that they would only attack in extraordinary circumstances, which they defined as an imminent threat issued by an American in combat. The examples they gave were September 11th or Pearl Harbor. And they made it very clear that when ordinary law enforcement can do the job, ordinary law enforcement should do the job. If the president adheres to this policy, are you okay with it?
I wish he would have gone an inch further and said, no drone strikes on U.S. citizens on American soil, period. That would have made me more comfortable as a Lockean conservative, as a traditional conservative. Briefly on the Rand Paul filibuster.
Yes.
I thought that what he did last week was a heroic and an inspiring attempt to incite public debate on this issue, to bring it to the people's attention,
I agree with you,
as well as the Senate at its best. We've ridiculed the Senate. We've talked about how they don't pass legislation, how they don't do anything. But this was the Senate with its grand old fire back in the belly.
I told you, I like the traditional
I applaud him, yes.
I do. But let me deal. So you say there should be no circumstance. So let's harken back then to September 11th. All you have to do is imagine that one of the 19 hijackers was an American citizen. It is not out of the question. We, after all, Anwar al-Awlaki was an American citizen in Yemen, apparently high up in the al-Qaeda leadership, who we took out with a drone. We can discuss whether you agree with that or not. But let's imagine that Anwar al-Awlaki was one of the 19 hijackers. That's not out of the question. He's on a plane. The plane is heading for the World Trade Center. Surely you're not saying the fact that he's an American citizen doesn't mean that we couldn't, in extraordinary circumstances of an imminent threat such as that one, shoot down the plane and protect thousands of American lives.
No, I'm not saying that, and that would be an extraordinary circumstance. But in that circumstance, or September the 11th, you wouldn't just have the drone. You could also scramble the fighters. You also have surface-to-air technology.
Why does a drone matter? Why does it matter if it's an unmanned aircraft or a manned aircraft? And to me, the question is military strikes against an American on American soil. That's the question that needs to be answered. The way we do it, is a drone somehow more unconstitutional than a manned aircraft?
Maybe not more unconstitutional, but it is less personal, maybe, to have...
Why does that matter?
It seems to matter intuitively, the idea of robotic assassins in the atmosphere, placing American citizens and everyone in this country on some grid, and then striking in various places, seems different from the president ordering fighters to scramble. So, let me back up then
to the question of drones abroad.
Okay.
There's Anwar al-Awlaki. He's in Yemen. Let's, and if you doubt this, we can discuss it. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that he is a bad guy. He's an al-Qaeda terrorist, and he has threats to harm American in mind. If you disagree with that, we can talk about that. But
no, I don't.
Okay, well, that we don't. Not at all. So let's assume that's true, or concede that it's true. The president has two choices. He can take a fighter jet. That fighter jet can go and drop a bomb on where we think al-Awlaki is. and that jet risks being shot down by surface-to-air missiles or others, or he can take a drone, do the exact same thing, piloted by someone with a joystick in Colorado. It is impersonal to be sure, but we don't risk the life of a heroic American pilot. Why is the drone somehow...
We don't. Third, he could do a CIA mission. That's a third option. But
which risks even more lives. I mean, SEAL Team 6, taking out Osama bin Laden, was far riskier than dropping a bomb. I mean,
it was.
I mean, we could have had 36 of our most heroic American soldiers
and they've voluntarily assumed that risk. But yes.
I understand that, but it seems to me that a drone risks fewer lives than a military strike. Let's start with abroad. Do you see any reason why a drone is somehow something we should use less than a military strike? If we could do it without
against terrorists abroad, none whatever.
Okay, so you don't see any distinction then. I say, why risk the American life? If we can do it without risk to American lives, that's the better way. The drone's better, in
I
fact,
see no
than a
reason not to. If you have foreign agents on foreign soil actively conspiring to murder Americans, there's no reason why you shouldn't
What do you have
strike.
an American citizen on foreign soil?
Well, then that would be a second gradation, like Anwar al-Awlaki.
Exactly.
In which case, you still make the decision. Then the other two gradations would be on American soil.
We'll get to that in a second. On foreign soil, I would actually make another gradation, and a very important one that the Attorney General makes, between a country with whom we have relations and a treaty of extradition, and elsewhere. I don't think it would be constitutional for the American president to take out an American on French soil, on Canadian soil, on English soil, on Italian soil. All those countries are Western democracies with whom we have extradition treaties. If we believe there is an American who is a terrorist on Italian soil, we should consult the Italian government, however dysfunctional it is, ask them to try that American citizen, put them in jail, and extradite them to us. So I would say it only applies to American citizens, or even probably even foreign citizens who are located in countries that do not have functioning democracies and an extradition treaty with the United States.
Functioning democracies or even functioning governments. I mean, clearly,
Yemen
this is just raw politics. The areas of our most intense drone activity tend to be failed states or extremely weak states. So Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, Afghanistan.
And I would make that distinction. The Bush administration famously, and I don't know if you know this example, but took a Syrian man by the name of Maher Arar, who was changing planes in Canada. He's going from Canada to Damascus. He was changing planes in New York City, and we grabbed him and we shipped him off to a secret prison in Syria where he was beaten pretty horribly. Turned out he was innocent. We thought he was a terrorist. But again, if we have a problem with a person in Canada, we have a great ally in Canada. We should be able to ask Canada to help us, and we should trust their procedures to do so. So I actually think we can agree that we should only be able to take these extraordinary measures outside the United States against people who are in countries that do not have functioning democracies with extradition treaties.
That's exactly right. And I'm more of a traditional conservative and realist than a neoconservative. And in effect, the way the game seems to be played is that we use the drones in areas where there's a lack of state capacity. If there are sufficient law enforcement institutions to deal with it, then you go through them. The same principle applies when we talk about the World Court, the International Criminal Court. They don't indict. They only indict people and do them.
They're not very effective.
Well, no, but they, for example, work through functioning governments if they're already in place.
So I think we're in agreement on use outside the United States. Now, in the United States, the Attorney General Eric Holder said we've never done it on American soil. We don't intend to do it. It would have to be an extraordinary circumstance for us to do it. But if you're asking us whether it is ever legal for us to do it, we would say only in imminent threat against someone in combat. That's the word he used, combat. In fact, first he said imminent threat, and then Rand Paul began to suggest that perhaps we could target Tea Party members in cafes, to which point Eric Holder said, if the question is whether we could ever attack an American who was not in combat with the United States, the answer is resoundingly no. So it would require an imminent threat of someone in combat. And combat's an interesting word. I was wondering if it might apply to Chris Dorner, the renegade Los Angeles Police Department officer who was shooting guns at police officers. And I would say no. I would actually argue that even shooting at police officers is not combat. To me, combat would be something like an army going after really beyond the capacity of our police forces to handle it. And an imminent threat would suggest something where that day, I mean that day, something is going to happen. I would say even if it's going to happen the next day, we should be able to take action other than lethal force. But given those very, very tight constraints, are you okay with a drone or any other lethal force used by the military against an American citizen on American soil?
I suppose if there were absolutely no other option. But I think the important point here is that it's not so much maybe the fact that there are certain might be missiles in space that bother people. It's the same sort of idea when we talk about establishing a national ID card or other efforts that might place this country, this land of liberty and of freedom, and for our citizens, on some sort of grid where our actions can be constantly monitored and where the federal government might intervene at any step. I think that's the real issue.
Aren't we already being monitored? I mean, this worries me too. I don't like that Google knows every place I go, and that I feel like they're probably watching my computer right now and wondering. I mean, I don't like that we have GPS systems. I don't even like, frankly, the red light cameras very much.
Yeah, sure.
But at the same time, that's the world in which we live. Frankly, private companies know as much or more about us than the government does. If you've ever seen your credit card report, you certainly know that. Facebook is
well, legally, one aspect of this is that the CIA officially has no domestic jurisdiction. So
True.
that is, the CIA cannot
True.
make an arrest, and yet the drone strikes go through them. So conceivably, by this model, a CIA drone strike could be used on American soil, which otherwise they do not have any right to take covert action domestically.
That's true.
That's the role of the FBI.
That's the role of the FBI. I can say this, that the wall, such as it is, between the FBI and the CIA was blamed for being the primary reason why we didn't find out about the September 11th attacks prior to September 11th. And that
I think it was a contributing factor.
One of the jobs of the USA Patriot Act was to lower that wall, was to allow transfers of information back and forth. To me, the issue...
It was, of course, the FBI was excluded from the Department of Homeland Security.
Right.
Raw politics.
It is raw politics. My point is this. I am not a fan of drone strikes, and I'm certainly not a fan of attacking Americans on American soil. I'm certainly a fan of due process. And I'd be willing to even pass a law that says if the president wants to issue such a strike, imminent threat, extraordinary circumstance, he has to sign a special order, or if it's truly imminent and some military person has to do it, they have to sign some special thing saying this is a special circumstance, and then it has to be disclosed within, say, 72 hours or something like that. I'm all for limitations and regulations on it, but I do think we need this tiny little loophole to deal with cases like September 11th.
Yes, we do. The Joint Chiefs acting under the president should be able to deal with anything, but it's just the psychological aspect of this that I think sort of frightens people.
And I'll tell you this, I'm glad that Rand Paul stood up. He and I disagree on many things, but I'm glad he brought national attention to this. It's something that we should be discussing, and I actually think that he and many Democrats who joined him are the reason why the White House disclosed those memos. The answer is, I think it is legal, but show us the memos. Let's do it all by the force of law. Speaking of the law, it's the United States Supreme Court that enforces it. We're going to get to their decisions coming up right after the break.
Osama bin Laden calls getting nuclear weapons a religious duty.
Today, materials that can be used to make nuclear weapons are stored in more than 40 countries.
Sometimes protected by just a chain-link fence.
Yet not enough is being done to lock down these materials
before terrorists steal them. Why did we learn all this?
My mother,
my son,
my sister-in-law
were all murdered September 11th.
Help protect America.
Together we can. Please join us.
The stem cell issue is being debated throughout the country. Truth is, most everyone has an opinion, even if they don't know the facts.
Let's stop arguing and start really understanding the potential of stem cell research.
For us and for millions of Americans living with disabilities, get the facts.
Call 1-877-842-3442 for free information from the Stem Cell Research Foundation. That's 1-877-842-3442.
Following the tragic events of September 11th, there have been hundreds of violent attacks against innocent Americans.
Remember what that flag you're waving stands for.
Remember, please stop the hate.
We're stronger when we are united.
Remember what that flag you're waving stands for.
One nation under God.
Indivisible.
With liberty
and justice
for all.
In America, there's either room for everyone, or it's not America. Don't pick the wrong fight.
Let's keep America land of the free.
Stop the hate.
Planning a home renovation? Put this at the top of your to-do list. Because after 10 years, none of you are protected against tetanus and another potentially fatal disease, diphtheria. A minor injury, such as a cut or a scrape, can put you at risk for a tetanus infection. And while safety gear offers some protection, an up-to-date vaccination called the TD booster is the best insurance against tetanus. So get the TD booster. If it's been 10, do it again.
We're back
host,
to the
Mark
Inside
Levine.
Scoop. Here again, your host.
The third branch of government, of course, is the United States Supreme Court, which is dealing with some very controversial cases. They held oral argument on the Voting Rights Act of 1965 just a few weeks ago, and coming up will be oral argument on some really pivotal gay rights cases about marriage equality. We'll deal with them one at a time. Starting with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, many people are familiar with the Civil Rights Acts of 1964. Those are the ones that desegregated businesses, allowed African Americans to go into hotels and watch movies and basically have equal rights to go places that whites have. That's not the thing being challenged. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, though, many people argue was just as important as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because it struck down a lot of techniques that many states and jurisdictions, mostly but not exclusively in the South, used to prevent African Americans from voting. Things like literacy tests. There were poll taxes, that was declared unconstitutional, but there were also really sneaky things, like saying how many jelly beans are in this jelly bean jar. They'd ask of blacks and not of whites. And the literacy tests would be asking technical questions about the American Constitution, again, only to blacks, not to whites. Whites were actually allowed not to answer these questions or pay the poll tax under things called grandfather clauses. They said basically if your grandfather wasn't a slave, well, then you could vote. You didn't have to pass these tests. All of these tests were thrown out by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And they said that there were a few jurisdictions, some whole states, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and Mississippi, but also Alaska and Arizona, so not exclusively in the South, and some jurisdictions, places like, I think it was Manhattan and the Bronx, but not Brooklyn, as I recall. Some places in Ohio, outside the South, were said, look, you have such a history of discrimination that if you propose a change to your voting that might affect African Americans, the United States Justice Department has to pre-clear that change before you're allowed to do it. This is called Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and it was the part that was up for consideration by the United States Supreme Court last month. Shelby County, Alabama, said that they didn't like having to pre-clear their changes in voting rights. Here's the interesting part about the Voting Rights Act that you may not know, though. If you haven't discriminated in 10 years, if you haven't done actions that the Justice Department has found to be discriminatory in the last 10 years, you're off the list. Well, Shelby County wasn't off the list because just 5 years ago, they redistricted the city boundaries to exclude the single African American councilwoman. So they're not off the list. My question to Mark Royce is, if this has worked so well that members of the United States Supreme Court are saying, hey, you know, there's hardly any need for it anymore, why shouldn't we just leave it in place and let it keep working?
Well, the arguments that I do think have some merit that maybe you shouldn't just leave it in place is because you are using old formulas. Voting Rights Act formulas derive from the 1960s and 1970s in terms of the offending districts or the problem districts. So you might have to revisit that in order to be fair. But the problem is the politics of that are just, or would be, enormously explosive to try to redefine which states and districts deserve particular consideration. And so I think it was the politics of that that was behind Justice Scalia's now infamous remark that I'm sure we'll get to in the next minute or two.
You could say what he said. What he said was basically that even though the law passed 98-0, and not too many things pass unanimously in the Senate these days unless you're naming a post office, even though it passed 98-0 with both of Alabama's senators voting for it, saying that Alabama needs special preclearance, that Congress couldn't be trusted to vote on its own laws, which seems to me that something King George III might have said, but it's hard to imagine a justice of the Supreme Court saying that he doesn't trust Congress. It seems to me that, you know, we have the Constitution to protect individual rights. This is under the 14th Amendment, and it's not only supported by the Constitution, it's also supported by Congress. What was Justice Scalia talking about?
Well, that is disturbing. Well, he really said two things that have really gotten people so much talking and people feel offended. The first thing that he said, with a number of civil rights leaders in the room, John Lewis, Representatives Congressional Black Caucus, was that the Voting Rights Act would perpetuate a politics of racial entitlement. All right. So that was an impolitic remark for sure. The second thing that he said...
And I would argue voting is not a racial entitlement, it's an American entitlement.
Certainly, it's a legal and constitutional entitlement. But the second thing that he said, which you just brought up, which I found more disturbing, was that it, quote, wasn't a question you would leave to Congress, as if Congress, which ultimately represents the people, shouldn't be the first and the last institution that sort of takes up these questions. That was more disturbing. The one time that I have spoken with Scalia personally about the legislative branch, well, it's fair to say he doesn't have a very flattering view of that institution.
No, he doesn't. And I've actually told on this program stories of my own personal meetings with Justice
He's
Scalia.
actually in the masthead.
I'd love to debate him again because both times I debated him, I think I made clear that I was a strict constructionist. I was the person who took every word of the Constitution seriously.
You have it in your pocket,
I do.
Yes, there it is.
I always keep it here as it's sort of protects me against...
and this is the 14th Amendment, your favorite sort of stomping ground.
It certainly is. Here's the thing. I think the real reason didn't have anything to do with the merits of the act. I honestly don't think that the conservatives on the Supreme Court were really arguing against voting rights. I think, honestly, it was a slight. Chief Justice Roberts, I thought, put it best when he asked the Solicitor General, the very first question, do you think the South is more racist than the rest of the United States? It was almost a slight to him that southern states, although, as I pointed out, it isn't exclusively southern states, but many southern states have to pre-clear their actions. I guess my response is, well, if you look historically and you look at the cases under the Voting Rights Act, you'll see that some 80% of them are in the 25% that are these jurisdictions that are under the Act. So I think there's historical analysis. But I would say, look, if you don't want to single out the South, fine, let's apply Section 5 to the entire country. I'm fine with that. What I'm not fine with, though, is getting rid of preclearance, because if you look at all the voting legislation in South Carolina and also northern states like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Texas, you'll find that
Arizona.
Arizona, exactly. Members of state governments have been drawing district lines.
Not African Americans, but Hispanics.
Well, in Arizona, it is Latinos. In these other states, it's African Americans. But have been designing voting laws, specifically in voter ID laws, to disenfranchise minorities that they think are going to vote for the party they don't agree with. To me, Section 5 of the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which struck down all of these laws before they went into place in 2012, is essential to our democracy.
I would like to believe that that is not the case, not essential. It's done great work, and I think it should endure for the time being. I would like to believe, though, that in its absence, we would not just revert to white primaries and poll taxes and literacy tests and all that sort of thing. I would like to believe it isn't just a particular section of or a particular law that is guaranteeing civil rights.
I'd like to believe that too. I'd like to believe we could live without murder laws and no one would commit murder.
True.
But yet we have murder laws because
but racial progress in this country is undoubtedly, we've made enormous progress. We have an African-American president.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. We've made enormous progress, but to say that racism is over, again, all you have to do is look at just last year in 2012 and all these state legislatures. For the time being, for at least the 25 years of the current Voting Rights Act, I think we need to leave this alone until Congress, in its wisdom, decides to change the law.
Oh, I wouldn't dare say that racism is over, but I would just propose that it is something I would like to ultimately get past. I think that if our democracy were functioning perfectly, we wouldn't need it.
Certainly we would all like to get past that. I just don't think we're there yet. Let me move on to the other Supreme Court case. It has to do with marriage equality. There's actually two elements to this. I actually think the first one is easier constitutionally to argue, and that's
which one?
That the Defense of Marriage Act is unconstitutional. Bill Clinton, actually, the president who signed the Defense of Marriage Act, just came out in an op-ed in the Washington Post, I don't know if you read it, saying that he was wrong to sign it and that he apologized for it.
Better late than never, I suppose.
What the act does, in essence, if you peel away all the rhetoric about gay rights and all the liberal and conservative cultural issues, you peel it all away, it seems to me that DOMA is an attack on federalism. States decide who gets married in this country. States like Massachusetts and Iowa allow gay people to marry. States like Mississippi and Kansas do not.
Or Virginia, where we are.
Exactly. Maryland, across the river, does. But the Defense of Marriage Act says that the federal government will not recognize states' marriages if they include same-sex couples. And it seems to me that this Constitution that I have in my hand says nothing at all about marriage. And if you look at the 220-odd year history of the United States, the federal government has always accepted the marriages of the various states, and they have differed. Some states allow you to marry your first cousin, some do not. There have been differences, and the federal government has always said if you're married under state law, you're married under federal law. You may disagree with me about Proposition 8, we'll get to that in a second, but can I get you to agree that DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, is unconstitutional?
I believe that it would be if you subscribe to a federalist position, which I would on the marriage issue. I do think that it seems to me that you either have federal regulations about marriage, such as DOMA, or you allow states to decide. It should be one or the other.
Now
so a decision has to be made.
There are federal rights for married couples. Social Security,
and the Constitution has established that marriage is a fundamental constitutional right. It has yet to say that same-sex marriage is.
That's true, and that may come up with the Proposition 8 discussion we're going to get to in a minute. My point is there's some 1,000 rights you get under the federal government if you're married. Everything from federal state tax benefits to you get Social Security benefits if one spouse dies. If there's a heterosexual married couple and the husband dies, the wife gets benefits. If there's a gay married couple and the husband dies, the remaining husband does not get benefits. And that, to me, seems first of all, a clear violation of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution.
Perhaps.
But it also, it says very clearly, when states decide you're married, you're married. There was not a single federal law in the books prior to DOMA where the federal government decided who was married and who was not, until that one. And for a conservative court that had a hard time finding any proposition to defend Obamacare, 1/6 of the nation's economy, it seems to me it's a lot easier to defend national regulation of health care than it is to defend national regulation of marriages. There's at least a tax and spend clause, interstate commerce clause, things like that. They go to health care. There's nothing about marriage to the federal right.
No, there isn't. And you might respond to that on some levels. I mean, from the historical point of view, no, the Constitution does not say anything about marriage because the Constitution was written in the late 18th century when basically there was no concept of homosexuality, even among the educated classes.
That's true.
The language, the discourse, you won't find it in Johnson's dictionary, so that's the historical point. Then the current dimensions are, yes, you have, if you're going to go federalism, allowing states to enable same-sex marriage like Maryland or prohibit it like Virginia, but then that conflicts with DOMA, a centrally administered. So you have nationalist conservative dueling with individual conservatism. You have libertarian constitutionalism at variance with federal imposition of a certain ideology or arrangement. So that has to be decided. And the courts are going to take it up.
And you would agree the Defense of Marriage Act is unconstitutional because there's no federal right to define marriage under the Constitution.
I'd agree that it's unconstitutional if you accept a federalist reading of state rights on marriage, yes.
I accept a federalist reading whenever I read the United States Constitution.
I know you do.
When we come back, we're going to talk about the other gay rights case before the U.S. Supreme Court. That is Proposition 8 in California. And move on to events in Rome, something we don't see that often, when a conclave of cardinals is getting together to choose the next pope. What will they decide? You want to call in? 888-488-MARK. Back after this.
This is firstgov.gov, where we're obsessed with getting you government information.
Brand new student loan applications on the site, baby. This calls for a celebration. Where's your uncle?
So in the end, it was either take the astronaut gig or come work here. What can I say? Duty called.
Dude, that's my cop.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, I'm pretty sure that's Sam's cop.
Oh, sorry?
Yeah. No. Sam's. No.
Just log on or email us and get what you need.
C, change of address form. That's how it's done.
D, driver's license renewal.
E, emailing Social Security information.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Nice, we'll allow it. All right, Ed.
What are those? Government surplus cars for auction.
You posted those online last time.
No, you did.
I'm posting them online this time.
For all your government information, firstgov.gov.
Oh, what have we got here? Sometimes you feel tired. You can't seem to lose those extra pounds off your midsection. And your joints hurt when you take the stairs. Well, you're getting older. But I'm happy to say that there's some simple things we can do to keep you happy and healthy for years to come. We can also lower your risk for some serious diseases the older population is often subject to. Proper nutrition is more important than ever. Your body has changed, you know. Not as many treats. A basic exercise plan, lots of walks and fresh air, and most importantly, come and see me for twice yearly checkups to help ensure the best possible quality of life. Now, how does that sound? Good boy.
Improve the quality of life for your elderly pet. Schedule twice yearly checkups that include preventive care and regular lab work.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back. This is Mark Levine. This is the last segment of the Inside Scoop. You can still call in if you wish to. It's 571-749-1166 or 888-488-MARK, 888-488-6275. My guest is Mark Royce, PhD candidate at George Mason University and the former president and chapter founder of the Alexander Hamilton Society, which preserves conservative thought. I am a dedicated liberal, but we've actually reached a lot of points of agreement tonight, and that's good to see. If only members of Congress could be as reasonable as we've been. We may disagree on this next one, though. I'm not sure. Proposition 8 was passed by the voters of California. The California Supreme Court held that marriage equality under the California Constitution, you could not deny the rights to marry to same-sex couples. And the voters of California then overturned the California Constitution through Proposition 8. That's also going up before the United States Supreme Court. And it's interesting to see the government, the Obama government has actually come out in favor of overturning it. And the argument is not quite universal. It basically says that once given this right, the voters can't take it away. I actually find more persuasive the simple argument that 14th Amendment applies to everyone and all the states have to allow it, much as Levine v. Virginia did. But I'll tell you this, I think if the court has to split the baby, they'll say that DOMA is unconstitutional, but they might still allow Proposition 8 to stand. What are your views?
Well, there's a lot in there. Definitely of the two gay rights cases that are coming up this March, and we should have rulings on them in June. This is the end of the term. Definitely Proposition 8 has much wider implications, not just because of California, but because of the precedent established for the same-sex marriage, anti-same-sex marriage laws in 40 other states, including Virginia and Michigan and just everywhere else. Most Americans live in a place where same-sex marriage is illegal. So if the Supreme Court takes a particular side, you have all of that gone. And that would just be an event of immense ramifications. I myself, as a cultural conservative, I do believe marriage should be between a man and a woman. But more importantly, as a constitutional conservative, I'm a federalist in the sense that I believe that popular sovereignty should be sufficient to address this issue. I believe that if Massachusetts has the right to enable same-sex unions, then Virginia should, by the same logic, have the right to proscribe them.
From 1948 to 1967, a number of states abolished interracial marriage. And California actually was the first state to have a Supreme Court ruling to say that it was unconstitutional under the California Constitution to prohibit interracial marriages. But there was a time when the vast majority of Americans lived in states where interracial marriages were abolished. And indeed, in 1967, there were still some 13 states, still about a quarter of the nation, where it was illegal for blacks and whites to get married. And the famous case, Mildred and Richard Loving were in Virginia, right in this state, and they were basically told that they had to leave the state or be arrested. They fled to D.C. and filed Loving v. Virginia. How is the Loving case different from today's cases on same-sex marriage?
To me, it is different because, I'll say this carefully but solemnly, it's different because I do not see the struggle for racial equality to be comparable to the struggle for marriage equality, because I believe that African Americans in our country were subjected to a far greater level of persecution and of oppression than gays.
But how
homosexuals have never been enslaved in this country?
No,
in the same way that blacks have.
And of course there hasn't been the genocide that we've had against Native Americans. So we can all talk about horrors that. But why should that constitutionally and legally make a difference if the answer is that consenting adults should be to marry each other? The argument was made in the Loving case, blacks can still get married, they can get married to blacks. Whites can still marry, they get married to whites. And popular sovereignty, the people of Virginia want this to be the case. no doubt the horrors of racial enslavement in this country stipulated, but how does that affect the constitutional legal question?
Well, it affects the constitutional legal question in large measure because of what level of scrutiny you apply to it. So typically, the highest level is your strict scrutiny, which typically applies to race, racial equality. Then you have heightened scrutiny, which is a more gender, keeping females from being excluded participation. Then you have your sort of broad floor of rational basis review, and the problem is that the highest court, the Supreme Court, has yet to issue a very clear sense of what level of scrutiny sexual orientation achieves. We don't know is this a strict scrutiny like racial, is this heightened, or do we defer to the Congress on a more rational basis? And so in the absence of that high level guidance, as it were, the inferior courts don't know what to do. And that's why we have this just all over the board and everyone being so confused as to what the future holds, is because at the highest level, we're just in uncharted waters. And so really it's anarchy.
I would argue that it's at least heightened scrutiny because it is a form of gender discrimination. A woman is told that she can't marry a woman even though a man can. So to me, that's blatant, not just sexual orientation, but gender discrimination. But I would argue that even under a rational basis, there's no rational basis for telling consenting citizens that they can't get married. I don't see why we tell some citizens they can get married and others can't. But I'm going to leave that aside for now because I want to use the last...
Well, you do have polygamy, and so we prohibit that.
We do.
And so I'm not necessarily comparing gay rights to polygamy, but it is something to consider.
My argument against polygamy is quite simple.
What is it?
It's equality under the law, and everyone has the right to marry one person, but not two. If there were two, you'd have to give twice as many benefits, and that would give more rights to the polygamist than to ordinary American citizen.
Philosophers call that an infinite regression.
Well, let's move on, though, to the infinitely even more difficult to understand wisdom of the Catholic Church. Rome is holding its, I don't know how many, 100th, 200th, 300th conclave. I have no idea. But it's very interesting, of course, Pope Benedict being the first pope to resign in some 600 years. And my question for you, Mark, is this, and you are Catholic.
No,
I'm sorry.
I'm an Episcopalian.
Excuse me.
But I am writing a dissertation largely on the Catholic Church.
Fair enough. Okay, so you're an expert in Catholic thought.
We'll see about that.
Here's the thing. 100 years ago, the vast majority of Catholics lived in Europe, with probably North America being second. That's definitely not true today. Today, only 1/4 of the world's Catholics live on the European continent. Some 40% live in South America, or Latin America. I should include Mexico as well, and the other 35% all around the globe, Africa, Asia, North America. Yet 2/3, some 65% of the voting cardinals are European. It would seem to me that Catholicism, which means universal, as a world religion, should reach out. There hasn't been a non-European pope, correct me if I'm wrong, but since I think the 6th century, it's been about 1,500 years or so.
Essentially never.
Essentially never. Okay, well, I thought there was one back in the 400s, an African pope or something, but I may be wrong about that. In any case...
The papacy didn't really come into existence until about 450.
Okay, so we can argue about who was pope then in 450. My point is, it's been an awfully long time, perhaps never. Isn't it time for Catholicism to show its universality and particularly reach out to the people of Latin America who are such loyal Catholics? I think it would be, it's certainly not my place to tell any cardinal what to do, but it seems to me that it would be a way for the Catholic Church to reach out to the more faithful Catholics around the globe.
It should certainly be one priority, reaching out to an increasingly globalized community. And the statistic that you quoted about the minority of Catholics who inhabit Europe, they also tend to be among the least devout as well. If you exclude Poland and Ireland, Catholics in Latin America and Asia and Africa are much more devout in terms of their attendance.
Even in Italy,
showing up.
Even though more popes are from Italy than any other country, Italians are notoriously not very religious.
Precisely, and the Catholic Church, though global in its scope, does remain essentially a European and particularly Latin institution, dominated by Italy, by Spain, by Germany, because that's where the seminaries come from, that's where the longest traditions of Catholicism are. So that's Bavaria and Italy and Spain tend to be the real soil that generates the popes.
So I'm going to ask you a dangerous question. You're the expert. You're writing a thesis on it. I'm going to ask you to predict. Will the next pope be European? Will the next pope be Italian? I'm going to ask you right now on television, and you know this is being recorded, to give me your best prediction of the next pope.
Whenever we go to conclave, there's always so much prediction in the press about the different alliances within the cardinal electorates, who's going to pick who. I dare not imagine, but I will give you a few of the leading contenders for it. First, if you want to root for the home team, as it were, we have a couple of Americans.
They'll never put an American as the Pope.
Well, I mean, you never...
I'd be willing to bet against that one.
Okay, okay. Well, maybe we'll put $5 down. But just for the sake of argument, we have Timothy Dolan, Archbishop of New York. There's Sean O'Malley, Archbishop of Boston, who are also leading Catholics. Within Europe, you have, within the European section, you have a couple of maybe kingmakers. There's the Archbishop of Vienna, Cardinal Christoph Schönborn, who sort of leads the liberal faction of the popes, as well as the Archbishop of Milan, sort of the heir to the great Ambrose. So you do have these contenders out there. But in terms of the politics of this, almost all of the cardinal electors, about 100 of them, have been appointed either by Benedict XVI or by his predecessor, John Paul II.
I think all of them have been.
I believe all of them have been. And they were both conservative popes,
yes,
traditional, restore authority, doctrinal unity, and so...
Yeah, I don't think a liberal has any
clearly,
shot.
the numbers are not there for Schönborn or another liberal candidate to step forward. It's not going to happen.
And one of my concerns is that Vatican II, which I certainly thought was a positive force, but actually many Catholic Americans think was a positive force in the church. I'm concerned that the reforms of Pope John XXIII are slowly being reversed by a very conservative papacy. You're writing a thesis on this. Is Vatican II largely being reversed, or is it here to stay despite the conservative nature of the cardinals?
No, I don't think it's being reversed. I do think it's here to stay. The reforms are permanent. Among them, the most prominent of all, which would be the Eucharist or the Mass in the vernacular as opposed to Latin, and then other more sort of classical liberal reforms. They wouldn't put it quite this way, but in dialogue with Protestantism. The institutions, the evolution, that's not going to be reversed. I do think that you will continue to find intransigence on some of the main issues that distinguish the Catholic Church. So clerical celibacy and...
No female priests.
No female priests. No, that's not going to happen. And then the continual power of the papacy in the Church. So institutionally, that's going to remain. It would really rejuvenate the church, I think, to have someone younger, because a whole generation, not just of Catholics, but everyone the world over, has sort of grown up with the impression of the Pope as kind of a weary old man who can barely recite the liturgy.
But you're not willing to predict a non-European right here on this show? I'm going to put you to the test here in the few seconds we have left.
I do think that Timothy Dolan could pull it out.
Really?
Yes, I do. I think it's possible.
I can't imagine an American, but I would hope at least they consider a Latin American, because that's, I think, where the faithful lies. Thank you so much Mark, for coming here on The Inside Scoop. Folks, if you want to see this show or any other show on The Inside Scoop, go to marklevinetalk.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at MarkLevineTalk. That's MarkLevineTalk. Also have a fan page on Facebook. Check us out, leave your comments, let us know what you thought of tonight's show. Mark, thank you again.